So, welcome to Conflict in the Middle East. And I think a good starting point would be to provide some basic background information about the Middle East, starting with exactly what is the Middle East. The term, as far as defining a particular region, definitely reflects a European perspective. It's a term that Europeans came up with and reflects proximity to Europe, hence Middle East versus, say, Far East, usually referring to China, Japan, Southeast Asia, and so forth. Middle East sometimes overlapping with Near East. Near East kind of corresponding to the same region, but reflecting more kind of an interest in the ancient world, pre-Islamic Middle East, if you will. So Middle East definitely is a kind of artificial term. Having said that, it's a term that actually stuck in the region. People in the Middle East often refer to themselves as Middle Easterners. A very important newspaper, Arabic language journal called El Sharq El Awsat, literally the Middle East. So for whatever, however it came about, it's definitely a term that has stuck. Having said that, though, we need then to think about which countries exactly are we talking about when we think of the Middle East. And there is some differences of opinion, though sometimes it depends exactly on what period of history you're looking at, whether you're looking at kind of more kind of political science perspective, economic, and so forth. But there are definitely some parts of the Middle East where there is a general consensus that, yes, these countries should be considered part of that region. Certainly, if you're talking about any of the countries that we find on the Arabian Peninsula, as per the map shown here, right in the center, no one's really going to dispute, for instance, that Saudi Arabia is part of the Middle East. Yemen, Oman, the United Arab Emirates, some of these smaller countries along the Persian Gulf, and so forth, generally agree that they are part of the Middle East. I do want to point out the term Saudi in Saudi Arabia refers to the ruling dynasty. So if you went back, say, to the 18th century or earlier, you wouldn't be referring to any particular territory there as Saudi Arabia, right? So another way to think of it is if the ruling dynasty were to be overthrown, they would have to change the name. But in any event, those countries definitely corresponding to the Middle East. If we move north from there, really no one's going to dispute the inclusion of Iraq, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and I'm going to say Israel/Palestine, kind of adopting a more neutral term, and we'll learn a bit more about that as we go further in the course. But basically, corresponding to a territory that two different national movements, two different nations, if you will, lay claim to. But in any event, those countries, again, no one really disputing that they should be considered part of the Middle East. And apart from Israel, mostly we're talking about Arabic-speaking people. I want to be a bit careful here, definitely Muslim majority, but there are definitely large numbers of people corresponding to other religions. And sometimes we often think of Arabic as referring to a particular ethnicity. So those countries indisputably part of the Middle East by pretty much anyone's definition. As we move further away from there, though, we do run into countries that some might dispute that they're fully part of the Middle East or that they really correspond to other regions. So, for instance, Turkey. I would argue the simple reason you have to include Turkey is you cannot do a coherent history of the Middle East regardless of what period you're talking about, if you don't include Turkey. Or at least that territory, even before there was a nation state called Turkey, which basically came about at the beginning of the 20th century. Having said that, you really couldn't do a proper history of Europe without including Turkey either. So, it also goes to show that, very often the divisions that we imagine separating different regions or continents are somewhat artificial and somewhat fluid, right? There's very often a lot of overlap. So we're going to include Turkey. And we're also going to include Iran pretty much for the same reason. You really just can't do a proper history of the Middle East without including Iran. Now, one thing I do want to make clear from the beginning, Iranians are not Arabs. They're not Arabic-speaking people. There certainly is a lot of cultural, religious, even linguistic interchange between Iranians and the various Arab states. But Iranians definitely see themselves as something distinct. They have their own language. You might say Iranian or Farsi, which, by the way, is not a Semitic language like Arabic or Hebrew, so it belongs to a completely different language family. But having said that, again, you really can't do a proper history of the Middle East without including Iran. And most people wouldn't dispute their inclusion. Now, as we move further away, I think that's where things become a bit more debatable. If you're talking about Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, you can see these are countries just to the north of Iran, corresponding to a region we often refer to as Central Asia. Definitely there are connections historically, linguistically, culturally, but pretty much you really can do a proper history of the Middle East without drawing them in too much. The same goes for Afghanistan, which I think in the popular imagination, at least in the United States, we often take for granted as somehow being part of the Middle East. I would say that they're really in this kind of intermediate zone between South Asia and the Middle East. And again, it depends on what particular history or historical developments you're looking at and so forth. So we're going to leave out Afghanistan for the most part, also Central Asia. And the same pretty much applies to the Caucasus region, these states like Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia, which you can see on the map just to the north of Iran and somewhat to the east of Turkey. Again, I mean, there are connections, and so we don't want to minimize that, but you can do a pretty fair history of the Middle East, either ancient or modern, without really drawing those countries in too much. That finally brings us to North Africa. And we can only see one country corresponding to North Africa on this map. That would be Egypt. But as a region, that would also include moving westward from Egypt, Libya, Algeria, Tunisia, and then finally Morocco. I would argue that there is in some ways more overlap in terms of historical connections, culturally, religiously, linguistically, and so forth. Having said that, you can do a history of the Middle East without including most of North Africa, with one notable exception. You cannot do a proper history of the Middle East without including Egypt. It would just, leaving it out would create really a very noticeable hole with respect to too many developments. Even if you were looking at the region from the perspective of political science or in terms of culture, religious developments, pretty much, any way you want to define it, you really have to include Egypt. The rest of North Africa you could include, and I've definitely read histories of the Middle East where they're included in that history. We're probably not going to be drawing the other countries of North Africa into our discussions too much, with the one noticeable exception of Algeria. When we get to kind of developments related to decolonization in the 1950s and 60s, I think, that's where you start to see a lot of connections becoming much more prominent, and it becomes difficult to talk about the history without considering developments in North Africa. Right. So in any event, then, just to summarize, primarily we're talking about the Arabic-speaking countries in the Arabian Peninsula, just to the north of that, Turkey, Iran, and Egypt, right, with at various points considering developments further afield. So we already mentioned that when people think of the Middle East, they tend to think of it as being made up primarily of Arab people. Arab here defining a particular ethnicity, but also a linguistic group, in as much as they predominantly speak the Arabic language. And certainly in some countries, there is a lot of truth to this. If you're talking about Saudi Arabia, for instance, about 90% of the population there would definitely be defined as Arab, linguistically and ethnically. That would include, by the way, large numbers of non-citizens, many of them what we might call guest workers, who are very often there for an extended period of time. Many coming from the neighboring Arab states, but you also have about 10% of that non-citizen population coming from Africa and Asia. In other countries like Iraq, while the Arabs make up the large majority, you have pretty sizable minorities. For instance, the Kurdish, who make up about 15 to 20% of the population, mostly centered in northern Iraq, and who definitely see themselves and are perceived as being a distinct people from the Arabs ethnically, linguistically, to some extent culturally, and so forth. And then even some smaller groups that, while not particularly large, are not entirely insignificant, such as Turkoman, Assyrian, and so forth. And then, of course, we have countries that, by and large, in the Middle East are not Arab at all. Turkey, about 80% of the population define themselves ethnically and linguistically as Turkish. I should note Turkish, like Farsi, spoken in Iran, is not a Semitic language, so it's not really related to Arabic in any direct way. And even in Turkey, even the next largest group, making up about 20% of the population, also distinct from the Arabs. About 20% of the population, Turkey defining themselves as Kurdish. And later on, when we look at conflict, particularly during the 20th century, that's going to be a very important factor. Moving on to Iran, there things are a little bit more diverse, though it can be a bit misleading. Persians making up about 51% of the population, but some other groups that are pretty large, very much strongly related to the Persians, ethnically, linguistically, culturally, and religiously, such as Azeri. But then other smaller groups that are in some ways much more distinct, such as the Kurdish, again, 7% of the population, and even a somewhat smallish Arab component coming in at around 3%. Now, we often think of the Middle East in religious terms as being in some way defined by Islam, and certainly the vast majority of its inhabitants are Muslim. I do want to point out, though, before we go any further, that the vast majority of Muslims in the world do not, in fact, live in the Middle East. So the largest Muslim majority country population-wise is Indonesia. And the country that has the most Muslims in the world, and this might surprise some people, is India, where they actually don't make up the majority, but there's just, really a lot of people in India. So, particularly later on, we're going to talk about the fact that there's kind of, in terms of practices, beliefs, how religion informs other aspects of one's life, socially, politically, and so forth, tremendous amount of diversity among Muslims, to some extent, depending on what country you're on and the culture and so forth. And I'm really stressing that because I think for a lot of people, when they think of Islam, it ends up being defined by a very limited number of images, often associated with not even just the Middle East, but for instance, countries like Saudi Arabia, where, one of the few cases where you have a theocracy where religion plays a very prominent role politically and so forth. Speaking of Saudi Arabia, of course, that is a country where pretty much almost 100% majority of the population are, in fact, Muslim. Most of them Sunni Muslim, and later on we're going to discuss the division within Islam into two major sects, the vast majority of which corresponds to the Sunni sect, about 90% of Muslims in the world, and then the smaller Shiite sect. So Saudi Arabia, definitely 100% Muslim. A country like Egypt, the vast majority of the population also Muslim, again in this case Sunni Muslim, 94%. But even though it might not appear to be a very prominent population looking at the graph, the Coptic Christian community there, which officially registers at around 6%, there are some, particularly within that community, would argue that they make up closer to 20%. But in any case, definitely a very important population, historically, culturally, and so forth in Egypt. The Coptic Christians, we might note, are a distinct sect of Christianity corresponding specifically to this Christian community based in Egypt. So, even though not particularly large, not insignificant as measured in other ways. And then there are some countries where you have really sizable Christian populations, and as we're going to learn later on, Christian communities that play very prominent roles in their countries politically, historically, and so forth. So, for instance, in Lebanon, about 30% of the Christian population is Christian. The vast majority of them belong to a sect known as the Maronites, very important. Even in the creation of Lebanon as a state, but also in kind of defining what Lebanese identity is and so forth. We'll learn more about that later. And we should note, too, that while 70% of the population there is Muslim, it's pretty much evenly divided in the case of Lebanon between Sunni and Shiite Muslims, right? So, and this kind of diversity in terms of different religious communities is a very important factor in understanding developments related to the Lebanese Civil War. Having said that, we're going to learn that it's not about religion per se very often, even if religious identity corresponds to other kinds of divisions economically, socially, and so forth. Speaking of Shiite Muslims, Iran is probably the most significant Shiite majority state in the world. So the Shiite population there making up about 89% of the overall population in Iran, and Shiism a very important aspect of Iranian identity culturally, politically, and so forth. But you do have a sizable number of Sunni Muslims there, about 10%, and then some other smaller religious communities, Zoroastrians, which is is a very small religious community globally. But very distinct, Jews, Christians, and another very distinct sect known as the Baha'i, which make up collectively about 1% of the population in Iran. And that brings us to the State of Israel, which in terms of the region, very unique both religiously and with regard to ethnicity. So I mentioned earlier that very often I will use the term Israel-Palestine, particularly if I'm referring to this particular territory, which is disputed between two different peoples, shall we say Jewish Israeli versus Palestinian Arab, though that's a bit of an oversimplification. But sometimes I'll refer to either Israel or Palestine if we're talking about the people rather than the territory or the particular state. In terms of particular governments with jurisdiction, in terms of set of laws, and so forth. So we're talking about Israel in terms of the Israeli citizenship, right? And I think most people recognize that the vast majority of Jewish, in fact, it might surprise some people to know that it's not 100% Jewish. About 20% of the Israeli citizenship is made up of non-Jews, most of whom would self-identify as Palestinian Arab. The Israeli state would refer to them as Israeli Arabs. Altogether, the vast majority of that subpopulation is Sunni Muslims, so that you end up with about 14% of the overall Israeli citizenship being Sunni Muslim. But then also a significant number of Christians, and then other groups that identify in different ways, either in more secular terms or in connection with various religious sects, such as the Druze. You'd be surprised there's quite a few Baha'is also located in Israel, and even Samaritans. But again, the vast majority of Israeli citizens being Jewish. In terms of ethnicity, tremendous diversity, because in many regards, if we look at the development of the State of Israel, very similar to the development of the United States in the sense of being an immigrant country, right, where you had large numbers of individuals who immigrated to what would become Israel, and then even after its creation, continuing to arrive from various other parts of the world. The one thing they all shared is that in some fashion they are Jewish. But I mean, if you're talking about individuals, Israeli individuals who can claim that their family goes back many generations in Palestine, really only about 21% can make that claim. Large numbers coming from Europe, from the Americas, many of them from the United States, about 14.5% coming from Africa, the vast majority of those coming from North Africa, and then about 12.5% coming from other parts of the Middle East, designated here as Asian. And then again, recalling that about 20% of the citizenship in Israel not defining themselves as Jewish in any way, shape, or form, but predominantly as Arab, right? So, in many regards, Israel very distinct from the rest of the region, and we'll of course be learning a lot more about how that came about later in the course. So, by way of background, I think we also need to think a bit about Islam, and I would say for two primary reasons, right? I mean, first of all, the advent of Islam and its development as a religion would, in many ways, also correspond to the development of a entirely unique and distinct civilization, what we might call Islamic civilization. But something that, in many ways, much broader than a particular religion defined by a particular set of beliefs and practices, and very much inclusive of large numbers of non-Muslims. So in order to really kind of understand the region, we need to think about Islam in terms of that kind of development. The other important reason is because, Islam, even just as defining it in very much more narrower terms as, just a very distinct religion with a particular set of beliefs and practices, while it has played a role with respect to various developments in the modern period, there is a tendency to exaggerate both the extent of that role and the nature of that role, in large part because of misunderstandings about what Islam is actually about and what Muslims believe and how they practice their faith. And so I really want, at an early point in this course, to really begin addressing those kind of misunderstandings. But we have to start with kind of, maybe some basic background about Islam as a religion. Now, by the way, the word Islam, literally the verbal noun for the verb aslama, meaning to submit. So, first of all, you might have come across, particularly on the internet where pretty much anyone can say whatever they want, that what this means is that Muslims expect non-Muslims to submit to their religion. That is not what it means. This is about individuals submitting to the will of God. And in many ways, this is a very common conception of the relationship between humankind and God, one that we find parallels within Christianity, Judaism, and so forth. For anyone here who's had some experience, for instance, with the Christian faith, very often this kind of idea that if you get right with God, if you submit to God's plan for you, kind of like you'll be swimming with the current, things will go much better. And kind of related to this is the idea that humankind, and this is evident in most of the major Abrahamic faiths referring to Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, the idea that humans have the free will to choose not to obey God or to submit to God's will, right? And so very often this is likened to, shall we say, swimming against the current, right? So there's kind of this idea that, God has a plan for you. Things will go much better for you if you submit to that, if you accept that. And within Islam, there is the idea that all things have their own Islam. Trees, rocks, the animals, the birds in the air, the insects, the fish in the sea. Only human beings, though, can decide to go against what God plans for them, right? So it's about submitting to the will of God. It's not about non-Muslims submitting to Muslims. The one who submits, and this is actually simply the active participle of the verb aslama, Muslim. The one who submits is a Muslim, right? Hence why someone who adopts the Islamic faith is referred to as such. So we're kind of talking about, shall we say Islam 101, just kind of the basic tenets of the religion. We might start with what are known as the 5 pillars of Islam, right? And so these are kind of the starting point if you become a practicing Muslim, how you should conduct yourself, how you live your life. In this respect, also reminds one that Islam, similar in some ways, more similar to Judaism than, say, Christianity, in the sense that it addresses the kind of particulars of how you live your life in a day-to-day basis to a fair extent. So the 5 pillars, and so just to kind of give an overview, and then we'll look at each one individually. The first would be shahada, or testimony, right? And this is effectively bearing witness that you believe that there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. Salat, or prayer, the worship of God. And we mean by this congregational prayer, right? The idea that you get together with other individuals to glorify God. And this should happen 5 times, 5 set times during the day. Saum, or fasting, which takes place during the month of Ramadan. And to be clear, it's not that you fast from beginning to end of an entire month. It's just during the daytime. Number 4, zakat, or tithing, providing for the needy as a specified share of income or property. Charity. Sometimes we say, alms in English, alms for the poor. And finally, Hajj, or pilgrimage, that at least once in your life you should make pilgrimage to Mecca, if at all possible. Right. So we'll look at each one in turn in a little bit more detail, starting with the first pillar then, shahada, or testimony. You could say the point of entry, statement of the core belief of a Muslim. La ilaha illallah wa Muhammad Rasul Allah. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. Speaking not just to the fact that there is but the one God, but the oneness and all-encompassing nature of that God. And very similar, by the way, to the Jewish core testament, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. So just another reminder of the similarity between these two major monotheistic faiths. The second pillar, prayer, salat. And again, we're talking about congregational prayer, wherein you glorify God. And as mentioned, this should happen 5 times a day at set times. So, a good question might be, how do you know it's time to pray? Well, most mosques will have, as part of its structure, a minaret, from whence the muezzin will issue the call to prayer. And so, for instance, if you're in a city like, say, Cairo, where you have thousands upon thousands of mosques, you'll really hear this call to prayer just kind of echoing throughout the city, coming from various points. And I've actually had the pleasure of that. So it's really actually something very, can be almost kind of transcendent. So I also put here an image of the Kaaba because when you pray, you should be facing Mecca, or the central shrine, the Kaaba being at the center of Mecca. And we'll talk more about that when we look at the 5th pillar. Now, by the way, there is a different term in Arabic for individual prayers, du'at, which in English sometimes we might use the term petition or devotional prayer, right? Petition is kind of when you're praying for something specific, the health of a friend, may I get a new bicycle, Christmas, or however, whatever it might be. Devotional, kind of reflective of a much more personal kind of interaction with God. But this actually is seen as something quite different from salat, prayer done in congregation and with the object of glorifying God. The 3rd pillar, saum, which is fasting, and this takes place during the month of Ramadan, and most people are aware of this. And again, a reminder, it only takes place during the daytime. And it's not just, by the way, the giving up of food, but also you shouldn't be drinking, you shouldn't be smoking, you shouldn't be engaging in sexual activity and so forth. But then in the evening, it's a much more kind of celebratory atmosphere, where literally people feast. And there's even kind of the idea, like if you're in a Muslim majority city, for instance, again, using the example of Cairo, you'll find as you walk through the streets, people setting up literally banquets, right? Very often the idea of feeding the needy and the poor as well. But everyone welcome, hence Ramadan Ramadan Karim. Karim, very common expression. Karim meaning generosity, right? So it should be one conducts themselves in a very generous spirit. And indeed, for most Muslims, Ramadan is something seen in a very kind of positive light. It can be a bit rough going the first few days. And as with any faith, it's hardly the case that every Muslim fully engages in fasting during the month of Ramadan. It does mean if you're in a city, again, like Cairo, people might be a bit edgy during the day, but, really very kind of beautiful kind of experience on the whole. And then one last thing I'll mention, right? Ramadan is actually the month on the Islamic calendar, and it's a lunar calendar, which means that the lunar year is much shorter than the solar year, meaning that the months of the lunar calendar kind of move through the seasons, right? So sometimes Ramadan falling during the summer, which of course can be pretty rough in the sense that the daytime period is much longer and much warmer and so forth, and then sometimes falling in the winter where you have shorter days. That brings us to the fourth pillar, Zakat, often translated as alms, basically charity directed at those in need. And sometimes this historically and even today might be institutionalized in some fashion, historically as a tax levied on all adult members of the Ummah or religious community. In many cases, it might also be kind of, more a voluntary thing that one chooses to do. This idea of tithing is not unique to Islam. Many churches do this as well, for instance. And, even in countries where it might be kind of institutionalized as a tax, at the end of the day, really not much different than the idea that some tax revenue should be used for instance, social programs and so forth. And that brings us to the fifth pillar, Hajj or pilgrimage, which takes place in the month of Zulhijjah. And there are many rituals associated with Hajj. Most important, of course, would be visiting the central shrine or Kaaba, which we see there. It's a term literally meaning cube as per the shape of the shrine, located here at the center of the Great Mosque in Mecca. And as you might imagine, given that there are roughly 1.6 billion Muslims in the world, the mosque is quite large in order to accommodate the literally thousands of individuals who on a daily basis are making pilgrimage. But again, there are many, many rituals associated with doing Hajj. Other rituals would include, for instance, running back and forth between the hills of Safa and Marwa, kind of, recreating this very famous episode from the Quran, a woman named Hajar who was seeking water for her son Ismail. By the way, this, kind of corresponds to a similar episode in the Bible. But in any event, supposedly she ran back and forth 7 times before finally God answered her prayers. And water came forth from a location called Zamzam. And today you can visit the Zamzam well and partake of water there. So another way of kind of expressing your faith through carrying out of ritual. And you might conclude the Hajj with a visit to the plain of Arafat, whence Muhammad made his final sermon to the Muslim community before passing on, perhaps passing by this column that you see in the upper right-hand corner, supposedly representing Satan and temptation. The tradition there is to cast stones against the column as a way of rejecting that. So many of these rituals actually corresponding to traditions and stories going back to the time of Muhammad or even prior to that. One very interesting thing we didn't mention, on the one of the sides of the Kaaba, there's a black stone. So part of the ritual when you visit the Kaaba is to circle the Kaaba and to touch the stone in the process. So, many different legends connected with it. For instance, one very interesting one corresponding to the life of Muhammad. Apparently, the stone had fallen from the wall, and it was considered such a great honor to be the one to put it back that the various clans of Mecca had actually fought over it. And Muhammad eventually was able to settle, or shall we say, mediate the conflict by coming up with a solution whereby they would all be able to participate in restoring the stone. And basically that they would all hold ends of a carpet with the stone being situated in the middle, and then carry it to the wall where it would then be restored. And here we see Muhammad actually putting the stone on the carpet, supposedly before he became a prophet, but even then had a very strong reputation as a just and fair individual. One thing we should finally discuss before we move on is the practice of jihad, or concept, I should say, of jihad, often assumed to be one of the 5 pillars of Islam, but in fact is not, which is not to say that it's not important, but that brings us to another point, that there are many misunderstandings, particularly in the quote-unquote West, in the United States and Europe and so forth, about what jihad actually is. Contrary to what is often asserted, it does not mean holy war. It means to struggle in the way of God, and in fact can take many different forms, one of which can be militant, and we'll get to that in a second, but I'd like to look at the other kinds of jihad very briefly, particularly given that historically, and for most Muslims today, these other forms of jihad are considerably more important. So first you have jihad of the heart or soul. Right? And this is kind of the inner struggle of good versus evil in the mind. Basically, the individual's struggle to do what's right, to resist temptation, and so forth. Jihad by the tongue, the struggle against evil through writing and speech, most commonly through proselytizing, trying to spread the faith through persuasion. And in this country, Christians engage in proselytizing much more than Muslims by far. Sermons, right? So if you were to attend the mosque, and after reading passages from the Quran, perhaps the imam leading the service might provide a sermon, explaining the deeper meaning of it. Jihad by the pen and knowledge, the struggle against evil through scholarly study, legal reasoning, and science. It's kind of nice to know that in Islam they really elevate this idea of, seeking out knowledge for its own sake, right? Like somehow just the act of doing that, even about secular matters, what we call science, is seen as being very virtuous. Jihad by the hand, the struggle against evil through actions or using one's wealth, for instance, to go on Hajj or take care of elderly parents. It could be political activity for spreading Islam. Just activism, right? It could be for social justice. Black Lives Matter could be seen as a form of jihad by the hand, for instance. And finally, there is jihad by the sword, armed fighting in the way of God or holy war. And to be fair, right? I mean, this is a form of jihad promoted by organizations like Al-Qaeda or Islamic State. Again, though, reminding everyone here that the vast, vast majority of Muslims do not support this form of jihad. They don't support these organizations. Having said that, let me just suggest that if you were to encounter a Muslim who, in some form said that they supported jihad by the sword, if you were to explore their thinking further, you'd probably come to realize that they understand this as a defensive action, right? That from their perception, whether rightly or wrongly, I really don't want to get into, whether in fact this is the case, but it is certainly would be a sincerely held conviction that the West is out to destroy the Muslim world, out to destroy Muslim majority countries. And again, we could debate whether their perception is correct, reflects reality, and so forth. Who started it? That's kind of beside the point. My point is that it is a sincerely felt sentiment. They really believe this. From their point of view, countries like the United States, Europe as well, have been out to destroy Muslim countries. And I would further suggest that, for someone living in the Middle East, it's not an entirely unreasonable perspective if you consider, for instance, American military activity in places like Iraq, Syria, the fact that we have military bases on the Arabian Peninsula. From their point of view, it does feel like, in this case, American armies marching all over the region. And so they would argue that, we're simply defending ourselves. I say this because very often jihad by the sword is presented in the media and certainly on the internet as being about Muslims wanting to impose Islam on the rest of the world. But again, if you were actually to engage in discussion with someone who supports jihad by the sword, you'd find out that it's something quite different. So we might conclude our basic background of Islam with a few words about the Quran, the foundational text of Islam. By foundational text, I mean kind of, what the Bible is to the Christian faith, the Quran is to Islam, literally perceived as the Word of God. The word Quran actually means recitation. So when, the words of God were conveyed to Muhammad through the archangel Gabriel, he would often tell Muhammad to recite. The Quran actually breaks down into a number of chapters known as surahs, each surah representing a different prophetic episode. And by the way, the Quran is not organized chronologically, but rather based neither chronologically in terms of the stories that are told or in the order that the surah were received. They're actually organized based on length, from the longest surah to the shortest surah. So we're not going to get into too much detail about the Quran, but I'll kind of conclude with, as far as the Quran goes, with one last point, which is the Quran, the way it's written, it very often assumes that you're kind of familiar with certain stories, certain individuals, certain figures, certain historical episodes. So very easy to misinterpret if you don't have anyone providing guidance. And that's actually a relevant point. We're going to kind of explore that later. But why, for instance, is very dangerous if you look at a small passage taken out of context, particularly if it's been translated, say on the internet, where someone might be trying to promote the idea that Muslims believe this, that, or the other based on this passage, right? So, the Quran in many ways, when you first engage it, it's very easy to become confused or to misunderstand some of what you're reading if you're not provided some guidance. I mean, that's kind of true of any religious text, but in some ways this can be kind of more of a problem with the Quran than, say, the Jewish Bible or Old Testament, the Christian Bible, which kind of reads like a chronological history. Or the New Testament of the Bible, if you're looking at the Gospels, they're pretty straightforward in a sense as kind of biographical accounts of the life of Jesus.